like to welcome you all to Mathieu's senior speech. I would like to extend a special welcome to his mother, Lauren, and his grandmother, Jeanette Hartman. Now, most of you all know Mathieu, at least a little bit. You've seen him in the halls, or hanging around on the senior furniture. And I know that most of us have had a problem with Mathieu. He's just, well, so shy. I mean, he hardly ever talks. And he's so serious all the time. Worst of all, you just can never, ever get him to give his opinion on anything, especially politics. And if you do know Mathieu, you know that everything that I just said about him is completely not true. Mathieu is anything but shy, and he has a lot of opinions which he will not hesitate to share with anyone, whether or not they want to hear them. And so, without further ado, here to present his opinions on something that is affecting all of us living in the United States is Mathieu.
Last September, when Occupy Wall Street camps began popping up in U.S. cities coast to coast, everyone from politicians to news pundits to students like ourselves had some opinion of these 21st century hippies. While many Americans disliked the tactics and fashion choices of Occupy protesters, quite a few shared the movement's opinion that the economy is tilted in favor of the wealthy. Demonstrators have spent months railing against the top 1%, trying to raise anger and awareness of the growing economic gap between the rich and everybody else in America. But just who are these fortunate folks at the top of the income ladder? Well, there were just under 1.4 million households that qualified for entry, and while $343,000 was the minimum income to be included, on average, top 1%ers made $960,000. According to a study by the Congressional Budget Office, in the United States today, the upper 1% of Americans are taking in about a quarter of the nation's income each year. In terms of wealth rather than income, the top 1% control approximately 35%. One response might be to applaud the ingenuity and ambition that brought good fortune to these people, and to argue that a rising tide lifts all boats. However, that response would be wildly misguided. Over the last decade, while the top 1% have seen their incomes increase 18%, the median family in America saw its real income fall 7%. Almost all the growth in recent decades has gone to those at the top, an unsettling trend which has positioned America on par with Cameroon and Iran in terms of income inequality, and one which must be reversed for the U.S. to remain prosperous. Some people regard income inequality as a non-issue. In a capitalistic society, they argue, it is natural for one person to gain while another loses. So long as the metaphorical pie is growing, the country will continue to flourish regardless of how that pie is divided. However, an economy in which most citizens are doing worse each year simply cannot succeed over the long haul for a variety of reasons. First, growing inequality is inevitably linked with shrinking opportunity, as children of wealthy and well-connected parents usually have a decisive advantage over other types of children. Whenever equality of opportunity is diminished, it means that we are not using perhaps our greatest assets, our people, in the most effective way possible. Second, this income imbalance encourages new conditions that further undermine our economic efficiency. For example, far too many of America's most talented youths, seeing the astronomical rewards, have chosen to study finance rather than pursue careers that would create a more productive and healthy economy. Third, and perhaps most important, a modern economy requires collective action. In other words, we need government to invest in infrastructure, education, and technology. The United States and the world have benefited greatly from government-sponsored research that led to the internet, to advances in public health, and so on. But America has long suffered from an underinvestment in these critical areas, and further cutbacks lie ahead. Ultimately, the more divided a society becomes in terms of wealth, the more reluctant the wealthy become to spend money on common needs. The rich don't need to rely on government for parks, or education, or medical care, or personal security. Instead, they worry about strong government. one that could use its powers to adjust the balance by taking some of their wealth and investing it for the common good. But while the top 1% may complain about the kind of government we have in America, in reality it caters directly to their needs. It is too gridlocked and too divided to pass comprehensive reforms without the addition of breaks for the rich. Economists are not sure how to fully explain the growing inequality in America. Labor-saving technologies have reduced the demand for many middle-class, blue-collar jobs. Globalization has created a worldwide marketplace, pitting expensive, unskilled workers in America against cheap, unskilled workers overseas. But one big part of the reason we have so much inequality is that the system has been built to favor the 1%. The most obvious example involves tax policy. Reduced tax rates on capital gains and corporate earnings, which are how the rich receive a large portion of their income, have allowed most of the wealthiest Americans to pay lower overall tax rates than middle-class Americans do. Also, lax enforcement of antitrust laws, especially during Republican administrations, has allowed monopolies and near monopolies to thrive, from John D. Rockefeller at the beginning of the last century to Bill Gates at the end. Finally, much of today's inequality is due to manipulation of the financial system, enabled by deregulatory policies that have been bought and paid for by the financial industry itself, through generous donations to state and federal lawmakers. Financial institutions borrowed money from the government at close to 0% interest, and even received generous bailouts on favorable terms when the system verged on collapse. In today's society, as we have witnessed time and time again, wealth essentially guarantees power. During the savings and loan scandal of the 1980s, the banker Charles Keating was asked whether the $1.5 billion that he had distributed among Senator John McCain and other politicians could actually influence them to take up his cause. "I certainly hope so," he replied. More recently, the Supreme Court, in its Citizens United case, has preserved the right of companies to essentially buy government. The 5-4 decision held that the First Amendment prohibits government from placing limits on independent spending for political purposes by corporations and unions. These worrisome examples demonstrate that the personal and the political are today in perfect alignment. Virtually all U.S. senators and many of the representatives in the House are members of the top 1% when they arrive, and are supported throughout their tenure in office by money from their fellow 1%ers. Representatives understand that if they serve the top 1% well, they will be rewarded by those wealthy individuals once they leave Congress. For this reason, it should come as no surprise that a tax bill can scarcely emerge from Congress unless big cuts are assured for the wealthy. Given the authority of the top 1%, this is the way you would expect the system to work. Of all the costs imposed on our society by the top 1%, though, perhaps the greatest is the erosion of the American dream. Our country has long prided itself on being a fair society, where everyone has an equal opportunity to make a name for himself. However, the statistics paint a drastically different picture. With the youth unemployment rate in America hovering at around 20%, and with 1 in 6 work-eligible Americans unable to find a full-time job, the chances of a poor citizen, or even a middle-class one, working his way to the top are smaller than in many European countries. Also, consider the fact that in the past decade alone, healthcare costs and college tuition rates have increased 1.5 times faster than wages, and it becomes abundantly clear that the odds are stacked against the average American from birth. In his book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville once describes what he saw as the chief reason for the prosperity of American society, an attitude which he termed self-interest properly understood. Not to be confused with unenlightened self-interest, which comes closest to our definition of selfishness, self-interest properly understood poses the question of whether it is not to the individual advantage of each to work for the good of all. Tocqueville believed that paying attention to everyone else's self-interest, in other words, the common welfare, is actually necessary for one's own ultimate well-being. He was not suggesting that there was anything noble or idealistic about this outlook. Instead, he understood a basic fact. Looking out for the other guy isn't just good for the soul, it's good for business. The top 1% may have the nicest houses, the most prestigious educations, the most advanced healthcare, and the best lifestyles, but there is one thing that money cannot seem to buy, an understanding that the fate of the 1% is connected with how the other 99% live. Throughout history, this is something that the 1% eventually do learn. Unfortunately, their epiphany often comes too late. Thank you.